Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Lee Lofthus, who's going to talk to you about, are the published outstanding national banknote data any good? He's going to give you the big picture.
All right, thanks, Peter. Hi, everybody. We are fortunate to work in one of those hobbies where there's actually useful, partial survival data on the things we collect. But the real issue for all of us, I think, is when we look at that survival data, the real issue, is it any good and can you trust it? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So you see this all the time in the catalogs, you see it in the advertisements. There's only $100 of something face value left, there's only 300 remaining, only one known. So you see this all the time. It's meaningful to us because it helps us collect, it helps us know what's rare and what not. But the real issue is when you see this stuff, how reliable is it? And this is where you see the origin of a lot of these statements on what survives and what not. Goes back to the Van Belkom data that he pulled out of the currency and bond ledgers at the National Archives. That data showed up in the Hickman and Oakes book. It shows up in the Don Kelly book. It shows up in a multitude of other catalogs. But you see the out in 1910 data that shows up in the reference books. You see it in the out at close and the out in 1935 and the large out numbers. So you see this survival data quoted in a lot of places, and it helps you know whether you got a chance on finding any notes in the future. And again, Van Belkom got the data off the currency and bond ledgers at the National Archives. He did a yeoman's job trudging through there for years, recording all the data. He also got the out 1910 data from specialized tables in the Comptroller currency annual report, and we can talk about what he did and why that data ended in 1910. And that is a page out of the Comptroller's annual report. That is one of the reports they did. These are all the banks that went out of business. This is the page for 1898, and you can see in the far column on your right the circulation, what they had issued and what the outstanding circulation was as of the year of the report. So if you look at an 1898 report, you're getting 1898 data. If you're looking at 1902, you're getting 1902 data, 03, whatnot. This page, I think, was from 1909, and the very last one was in 1910. So the Comptroller's office, when a bank went out of business, they painstakingly, every time a Warren note was redeemed or any note was redeemed for those banks, they kept a running declining balance for all of those banks painstakingly since 1863 all the way to 1910, and then they quit. So it's really cool data. Here's a really cool note. This bank in 1910, you just have fantastic rarities. This actually is a pretty high 1910 out number at $3,600. So that's actually a pretty high out in 10 number, even though the bank is pretty scarce. Here's a Midwest example for those of you folks in Missouri and Kansas. Cool note. You can tell the typeface is the typeface from Peter's presentation yesterday. Nice number one note. Here's a bank that only had $435 out in 1910. So we all place great reliance or great interest, I'll say it that way, in these numbers. So the punchline here is, are they any good? And the answer is they're riddled with problems of different varieties. So we'll talk about those problems today. You got problem number one is they simply, as they were having clerks in big rooms, think of the bourse floor out there with all the dealers on that bourse floor. Think of that room with tables. They were actually individual oak tables, and I got pictures of them. Think of a room that size filled with all women with male supervisors, all women at tables sorting hundreds of millions of dollars of notes and trying to get them right and get them right by bank. And that's a pretty big challenge. So it was a massive manual exercise in a day before computers, everybody doing the math in their head, really a huge effort. That effort resulted in a lot of errors, and we'll talk about that. You had a problem when the banks extended their charters They had a peculiar way of doing the accounting when a bank extended its charter, and it's not what collectors expect. It made sense for Treasury because their business was monitoring the real circulation of every bank and the liable circulation of every bank and what Treasury was liable for. They didn't keep these numbers to make collectors happy 120 years later. They kept it to keep Treasury liability statements correct, and they're two different things. And the last thing is the 1910, out in 1910 data. They had huge problems keeping the banks straight, and they messed up the 1910 numbers for many banks, and we'll talk about that. So the sorting errors infected the large out and out at close numbers. So this is actually what got me into this, was a conversation with Peter well over 10 or 12 or even 15 years ago, 12 or 15 years ago. I was looking for something to do at the archives, and he said, go figure out this Gardner Bank, this Gardner, Oregon bank. And you can see this is from the Hickman and Oakes book. And it says, the sheet is the Comptroller sheet, says all the notes were redeemed on large size. Whether that's true or not cannot be determined. Actually, it can be. There you go. And now there are, I think, 11 or 12 of these notes known today. So when people say all the notes are redeemed, not so fast. And this was really interesting because I got into the ledgers. I went through all the Gardner ledgers, and you start to see why it's very true that what Van Belkom recorded on the Comptroller sheet, that they were all redeemed, is 100% accurate, meaning Van Belkom did not make an error. Van Belkom picked up the number the Comptroller computed. But that number was wrong, and I'll show you why. So on Gardner, Oregon, again, there's 11 or now 12 notes known, I think. And if you really get into those ledgers, not on the last page where Van Belkom picked up the number of notes still out, which said none. If you really got into the details of the prior pages, though, there's $1,660 in $10 bills from other banks that were scored against the Gardner Bank, making it look like all the Gardner notes were redeemed. They weren't. Those 10s were from other banks. There's other examples. Mount Savage, Maryland. Really small, large out, only $220. You get into those ledgers, $420 from other banks. You say, what other banks? We have no idea. All we know is they weren't from Mount Savage. Ventnor City, New Jersey, 480 reported large out, but $140 in 20s from other banks were recorded against this bank, meaning the $480 is not a good number. So, and what Treasury even had a word for these errors. They were called over-redemptions, meaning they redeemed too many of a given denomination for a bank based on what the bank actually issued. So let's see a full example here. This bank is a really scarce bank. If you look at the large out number, only $40 large out on First National Bank Elkins or Citizens National Bank Elkins. $40 is pretty darn scarce note, right? So there's the survival of them, survival of one of them, Citizens National Bank. It'd be nice if there was only $40 out, but there's already $45 worth of these in the census today. So we know 40 out is not an accurate number because we got $45 worth of these notes surviving. So where did they screw up? This is the currency and bond ledger page for Citizens National Bank. The way these pages worked is there's a bond box in the big middle of the page. There's over here is notes received from the BEP and held in the vault. Over here is notes issued. On the far end is notes redeemed. So here you go, large size, Elkins, West Virginia, notes issued, 5s, $20,300, notes issued. Redeemed, $20,430. They got an extra $130 worth of somebody else's 5s recorded against this bank in the ledgers. So that's where these errors start coming from. And if you say, why didn't the banks catch these? Why didn't the banks raise hell with these people because of all the errors? The banks never knew. They never knew. There's no way they could have ever known. A bank only knows what's in their cash register, right? Or what's in their teller cages. They have no idea what's out there in people's pockets, in the cash registers in town. They don't know what's in somebody's mattress, and they don't know what is at the National Bank Redemption Agency until the NBRA sends them notice and tells them. The bank can't tell what's out there in circulation. All they know is what they're holding. So when these errors are being made, the banks never see these things. The banks don't even get hurt by it. In that Gardner example, when they redeemed a bunch of somebody else's tens, the Gardner Bank got money for those things. It went out. But Gardner wouldn't know it was extra money because they don't know where the rest of their circulation is. So that's why these errors could keep going. Sometimes the clerks at the Comptroller's office and the NBRA caught these things. Here's a bank, Kingsville, Texas, and you can see this is charter up there in the corner, charter 12968. This is small size error. They did a redemption against this bank. Somebody caught it and said it should have been on charter 12967, the following page in the book, or the prior page in the book. So they catch some of the errors. They don't catch them all. Here's a good one, and this is really fascinating when you get into this. Looking at Holland National Bank, Indiana, they got $580 large out. And this one the clerks caught. They caught it when somebody brought in a large size 20 and they redeemed it, and suddenly the clerk saw, but we already redeemed all the large size 20s. Here's another one. Now what do? They just arbitrarily knocked the large size 20 redemptions down by 600 and increased the small size 20 redemptions up by 600. The page balances, the clerk's not in trouble, the banks never know, life goes on. But this is totally arbitrary. I found a number of times when they did this, they just swoop in, and because large and small are out of balance, if they got enough play in one category versus the other, they just drew a line through one, changed the number, and life was good. They moved on. There's lots of this. So this entry for Holland, Indiana creates a fictional large out number that's now in all our reference books. Pick up the book today, it says 580. The 580 is totally fake. Totally fake. So when I was doing this big time at the archives, I quit at 60 banks. It's not like we found 5 of these banks or 6 of these banks. I quit at 60 because I'm actually employed and had to go to work and couldn't spend my whole life there. I just quit at 60. But I mean, you go spend enough time there, you can find more and more and more. Remember, for every bank with an error, there's some unknown bank out there that's books are also contaminated now, right? Because if you score something against Gardner that's not Gardner's, the right bank didn't get their redemption scored against them right. So this infects all the books in a growing number of banks. And really important to know, this affected both large and small. Obviously, the out in 1910 numbers are only large size notes, but even through the 1930s, you can find redemption errors in the ledgers on the small size notes as well. So it affects both large and small. Again, why is it happening? They're dealing with millions of notes. These notes come in sealed registered packages with wax seals. They go to teller cages that are all around the big room, just like the bourse floor. They're on the outer edge of the treasury rooms. The clerks sign out the packages. They have to sit there and sort them, make sure they get them in the right banks, and it's a massive job. That's kind of the end of the process there. That's not actually sorting. That's on the way to destruction. But, you know, these are dog-eared, ratty, worn, raggy notes, and to keep them all straight is a real challenge. So this stuff is everywhere. You just have to imagine the bourse floor filled with people at little oak tables counting this stuff. So they actually made some changes to keep up with the workloads, and this led to, I think, a lot of the problems. They were trying to save money. They were trying to be efficient, and they came along and they said, look, we do too much paperwork here. They used to keep a running total to make sure 20s issued and 20s redeemed never got out of whack, that they always knew they were right. They did away with that because it took too much clerical time. So they dropped that off. So the key warning signal that they had counting errors was removed. So now you're only relying on the first clerk who did the counting. And again, it was supposed to save time and money, but there goes the ability to detect the errors as they make them. So this is interesting. If you don't know how they actually sorted the currency when it came in, I think most of us think that they sat there and sorted it by charter number for several decades. That's not the way it worked. Notes were sorted alphabetically by the first letter of the town name with no regard to the state they were issued in. So they're sorting by the letter of the town name. Can you imagine that? And the way they orchestrated it is, if in this room, this side of the room, you would be assigned to sort only notes from New England, you would sort notes from the Midwest, you the Pacific, and so on. You guys the South. So they had teams built around geographic areas, and they named them groups. This is group 95. They had 100 and some groups. So you were all divided up into geographic areas, and you were supposed to become experts on your part of the alphabet in your part of the geography of the United States. It wasn't just sort it by charter number and you're home free. It wasn't anything like that. 1921, they get rid of the sorting by the first letter of the alphabet. They realize it's a nightmare. The circulation by now is over $700 million a year. They can't keep up with things. They have huge backlogs in currency. So they changed to a charter number sort. That's why your large nationals get rid of the geographic letters. They're also having people steal notes, obviously bad. So they changed the way the notes are counted and sorted. What they do is they issue an order. Jamie mentioned William Broughton, the Commissioner of Public Debt in the prior presentation. Between Broughton and the head of the National Bank Redemption Agency, they make a decision that they're going to cut the nationals in half now when they come in. When they immediately receive them and open those paper registered packages, they immediately cut them in half to cut down on people pilfering the notes. These are $10 nationals in that stack there, but there's a guy, there you go, destroying our collectibles there by cutting them in half. So they cut these things in half. So here's a kind of a raggedy old note comes in, and in the old days they'd count that note in a big pile. No longer, they start counting these things. They cut the notes in half and they punched holes in them, and then they gave somebody a half a note to figure out which charter it was and where it came from and who gets the accounting. They kept this up in the small size era. I don't have a picture of somebody at their desk with a large note, but if you pay close attention here, these are the clerks. That's a whole room of these desks. This is a woman sitting there with horizontally cut small size silver certificates, or yeah, those are probably FRNs or silver certificates. So they cut nationals in half down the center vertically. They cut non-nationals horizontally down the center this way, and that allowed them to make sure they didn't mix nationals with other notes. But they're having the same problems all the way into the small size errors, so they cut these notes in half that way. If you don't think there's a lot of this stuff and this wasn't misery, there's a wall of that stuff. And can you see, those are $1 silver certificates cut in half lengthwise. There's a wall of this stuff. Can you imagine all day just counting this stuff? All manual, all done by pen and ink in a ledger. So it's easy to make errors. So here are the sorting sheets. This is actually on the Comptroller's issue division side. You can now see this is group 28, so they still had groups, but they're now in charter number order. Nice charter number order, and no longer in alphabetical order. But the issue division scheme for sorting and issuing was the same as the National Bank Redemption Agency. They had to keep them in sync, so they changed them both at the same time. And That's a neat sheet because it shows you every bank when it got a new delivery of notes, shows the denomination, the number of sheets and whatnot. So that's the first problem. It was just a massive sorting exercise and it was very difficult. Large outstanding doesn't even mean what we think it means when you look at extended banks. So if you collect banknotes from a bank that was extended, you got a real problem looking at these numbers. So if this is a cool note, Butte, Montana, territorial, beautiful $5 there. So I used to really like this bank and pay a lot of attention to its notes and try to get some notes, not a territorial, but I really liked this bank, and I went through the ledgers very carefully and had all the pages and whatnot. And what's interesting is, here is their ledger page. This is the last page. This is what Van Belkom used to record how many notes are outstanding for First National Bank of Butte. Notice anything interesting? That $5 territorial under old series redemptions, 0. Doesn't even exist. What happened to it? If this is a ledger page of all the bank's issues and redemptions, how come that thing's not there?
They don't have a column for it, do they?
Well, they would have had it here under 5s. Yeah, they would have had it under 5s. It's not there. It's just not there. Yeah. And what's interesting, if you do the math, if you know how Kelly and Hickman and Oakes have so many issued of each sheet and you can do the math and figure out what was issued, there's the total issue according to the Comptroller, $483,320 for the whole bank issue. It perfectly lines up to only the bank's 1902 notes. All the brownbacks are gone, all the original series are gone. They just wiped them off the books. They're gone. So how can you trust these numbers? So why are they gone? They're gone because of this. This is what kind of collectors, I think of large out. Large out means all the banks the notes issued by the banks, less all the ones that came in for redemption, equals large outstanding. That's intuitive, and you would think that's the way it was done. Of course, that's not the way they did it. This is how they did it. Large notes issued, makes sense, minus the redemptions, makes sense, minus lawful money deposits, equals large out to the Comptroller. Not to us, but it meant large out to them. So what do I mean by lawful money deposits? Here's the definition of large outstanding. They're tracking a bank's circulation for which the bank is liable. And the banks were not liable when they extended their charters. The law said under something called Section 6 is, if you extended your charter, everybody knows that when you extended your charter, you had to get a different design note. So the brownbacks became the series of 1902 and so forth. That was required by law, that your next group of notes have to be a different design. The rule was that 3 years after you changed designs, if there were still any old notes, your original notes, outstanding, you had to settle up with the Treasury for those old notes still in circulation by sending a lawful money deposit. That's a fancy term for sending in legal tenders. And those deposits totally distort the large out for any extended bank. So here's an example. Cheyenne National Bank, Wyoming. This is a really early bank. This is a circular statement of, it's basically a balance sheet for the bank. Assets, liabilities over here. National banknotes outstanding, $33,750. That's a liability. And that's basically their circulation that the Comptroller is tracking. So here's a couple of examples of how this worked and why our numbers are so odd now for all the extended banks. So this Section 6 closeout, this is Breckenridge, Minnesota. When this bank extended its charters for the first time, it had to wipe notes off its books. And here you can actually find these things in the currency and bond ledger. So in red ink here, and red ink meant something to these guys. It's not red ink like we think of businesses losing money. It was a signal to them on what requires a replacement and a redemption and what doesn't. Dropped to close Section 6. They took $80,800 off the books of the issued notes for this bank. They just lopped them off. They lop off an equal number of redemptions to clear out all the old series when they got lawful money. So the bank sent in 80,000 bucks and lopped off that stuff. So big numbers get lopped off these reports. Here's, to just do this by math to track this. Take a little bank that had $10,000 out there in 82 brownbacks, right? And over the years, 8,000 of them redeemed, and then the bank extends, and 3 years later, they still have $2,000 in their brownbacks out, right? So they had to send in legal tenders of $2,000 to settle up for their old brownbacks that never came in. What happens is, in series of 1902 notes, they get $8,000, plus the comptroller sends them 2,000 in new 1902 notes to make up for this stuff they settled up for. So they still got their 10,000, right? It makes sense. They started with 10, they still got 10, but they had to pay back 2,000 for their old brownbacks that are still on the street, and they get series of 1902s in replacement. So if you do the math by the way collectors think, and let's say $9,900 came in redemptions in succeeding years. Our out in 1910 is only $100 for this bank, right? It's a $10,000 circulation, $9,900 comes in our example, so there's only $100 large out on the street, and that's what our reference books say. It's actually a fake number. The potential of large out is $2,100, right? It's this $100 plus the $2,000 that was never accounted for the first time. That doesn't mean these things necessarily survived. It just means the comptroller has no idea if they survived or not, and neither do we. So you just can't take these numbers as gospel. Here's a big example. This is Montgomery County, Rockville. I grew up here. Fred Maples is here in the crowd. Fred lives near here. Basically, this is a bank that started with brownbacks and issued a lot of notes. This number here of total issues is only their 1902 notes. They wiped off all the brownbacks. And so, according to our books, there's 5810 out on the ledger. But actually, if you do the math, the unredeemed notes in this bank were 28,380, not 5810. The real unredeemed was 28,380. In 1908, the comptroller says, this is madness. We can't keep up with this. The accounting is a nightmare. And they simply couldn't keep up with it anymore because what they were doing is, if you had a brownback bank and they got O2s, red seals and blue seals, when those things were redeemed, they were actually recording them separately by series. It was a nightmare. It even was more complicated than that. But in any event, in 1908, they give up on it and they just redeem the notes as they come in to wipe out the old series, and the math starts to make sense again after 1908. But if you have an extended bank that basically has numbers that start from before 1908, the large out numbers, don't trust them. And the last, we'll bring it home here without 1910. You have a guy at the head of the comptroller's office named Lawrence Murray. He was a reform guy as well. He was looking for ways to cut costs and cut the work there. Just like the decision to stop tracking the issues against redemptions and that warning signal was gotten rid of for the sake of expediency, he gets rid of the accounting they were doing that was tracking the declining balances of all the banks that closed. That led to the out in 1910 numbers. All that accounting for closed banks, they used to painstakingly record every note that came in from every closed bank. In 1910, he says, to heck with that. That's a lot of work we don't need. All the banks settled up for those notes, so they're all treasury liabilities, so we don't need to do bank-by-bank accounting for it anymore, and we can get rid of all the clerks who have to do that work. That's what we're going to do. That decision was made in 1910, so that's why it just says out in 1910. There were a couple other refinements for liquidated and banks and receivership. That's why you sometimes see out in 1915 in the catalogs. They did away with those a few years later. This is the way you think the accounting works for redemptions. This is a rare note, proof of a rare note from Guernsey, Wyoming. This bank closed pretty early in 1901. It has 595 outstanding in the books for 1910. And their redemptions make perfect sense. It's the only bank in town. It's got a unique name. It was probably easy to track. And you can see a nice declining balance over the years here. At 22,000 out, it drops to 15 to 8 to 4 to 2 to 1,800, all the way down to 595. And if every bank was like that, we'd all be really happy and we could really trust these numbers. But the banks aren't all like that. We can't really trust the numbers we see here. The answer to this is no, we cannot. And here's why. This is Granville, Ohio. And there were two banks, First National Bank in Granville. 388 was an early bank, opened in 1864 and was gone by 1879. And when it closed, it had 34,000 and change out on the street. The next bank, the replacement bank, opened a year later, closed 6 years later at a new charter number, 2496. And this one closed with 26,000 bucks on the street. So 24 years after the second one closed, they both have $1,040 out. Identical. And this one I actually was brought to my attention by Don Kelly, who said, is it possible those numbers are legit? And I went into the ledgers, and the ledgers are actually a nightmare for this bank. This is, not only is this improbable, we now know it's more than improbable, it's actually, there's no way. Here's part of the problem that this room full of counters was facing. So here's Charter 388's note. The BEP, when the second bank came along, they already had a plate for this bank. Why not use it? It's the same darn layout and plate. All they did was new signatures and a new date here. Not even a new name. They just changed the date over here. The organization date or charter date or batch date, whatever it is. But they just used the same darn notes. And remember, lots of these early notes didn't have charter numbers on them. They weren't using charter number to begin with. So who was going to keep these things straight when they came in? So going through the Comptroller ledgers, we reconstructed them for 14 years. Look at this. The out in 1910 data between the two banks, they couldn't even find the right pages in these ledgers to record the right balances. You can see this bank, at one point they said all the notes had been redeemed, and then suddenly the notes are back. The bank's not even open, and yet now they're issuing more notes. And they're identical in years. Just think, if they had made the decision to quit in 1906, you'd have one bank with 1,066 out, and one bank would be all redeemed, just like Gardner. But we'd know it was fake. These things were all screwed up. They didn't realize, the clerks, when they did the annual report, didn't realize the ledgers had two Granvilles in the big ledger books. They didn't even find the right pages. And you may be saying, how could that be? The banks must be right next to one another in those books. How could they screw this up? How could they miss it? That's not the way it worked. The banks were nowhere near each other in the ledgers. The ledgers weren't alphabetical or by city and state, or it had nothing to do with that. The ledgers were maintained by the month, day, and year the bank went out of business. So the pages for these Granville banks aren't even in the same ledger probably. They're 20 yards away in a different ledger in a different room. So if you're a harried clerk, you're going through the book, you find First National Bank of Granville, you write down the first number you see. And that's how those things get screwed up. Then the sorters can't tell one note from another because they're using the same plate. And they both say First National Bank of Granville. And there's lots of examples of these things, you guys, lots and lots of them. And so just know that 1910 numbers are really suspect for a lot of these banks. For a few of them, they look reliable. For many of them, they look like they're just bad. You can just see, you reconstruct it, they're useless. So you got to be really careful with this. So if you can't trust the catalogs, what can you trust? Circulation amounts are important. Bond sales, and I got an example here of what I mean by that. Hoards obviously will make a rare note, turn it into something pretty common if there are hoards of things, even with large out numbers. Census data, you want to look at all those things. But if a note comes along as a new discovery, better look very carefully at the circulation numbers. Again, bond sales. Look at the serial numbers. That may not be really obvious why I say look at the serial numbers, but if a number 1 note comes out, its 3 sheetmates may be somewhere with it, or its 6 or other 5 sheetmates may be somewhere with it. But if the number's, 673, it may be a freak lone survival. But you got to think about things like that. So we'll close with kind of a little Midwest case study here. Neat red seal on Seneca, Missouri. And you'd think this would be a rather available bank. It had a $25,000 circulation, which was pretty big for a red seal bank. A lot of those were only 6250 circulation banks back in the day. 4350 was the last outstanding number, so pretty healthy outstanding number. So you'd think those would be available. But there's a lot more to it. If you look behind this bank and you start to get into the ledgers and the treasury reports, you find out that the bank opened in March of 2005. It was only open for 18 months. But it wasn't even open for a successful 18 months, because if you get buried in this ledger stuff, long before they closed and hung it up 18 months later, they cut their bonds back from the 25,000 or whatever it was. They cut the bonds back to the minimum circulation amount, 6250. So they sold their bonds, condensed their circulation, and that meant they had to pull those notes back out of circulation and get those things redeemed and destroyed. Their last report made to the Comptroller reported their circulation not even at 6250. They were obviously trying to avoid the tax on the circulation. They reported a circulation down to 3450. So that's not a $25,000 bank out there that the books make it look like. This is a bank that drastically was shrinking and curtailing its operation right before it went out of business. These guys were pulling back their bank, pulling back the currency. They probably kept as much currency as they could in their own vaults and shipped it all in redemption, so they're not liable for it. So this actually had a really short life and a short circulation, because the bank itself was sucking all this stuff back in and didn't want this stuff on the street. And that's why it's one of one known, unless somebody knows another one's come along. But yeah, really interesting stuff. If you get into what's behind some of these banks, it's really deceptive. The numbers sometimes, unless you really look behind them and start questioning the data. So anyway, it's one of the things that makes this hobby great, that you have all this data to play with, but it also means you got to look at it really closely. So that's it, you guys. Thank you very much. And oh, wait a minute. Just like Monty Python, but wait, there's more. Well, this is the wrap-up. Are more nationals going to come out? So real quickly, 89% of all the nationals were pulled from circulation and destroyed within 15 years after 1935. 97.4% were redeemed by 1970. Only about 20 million face value were outstanding. And in 2017, there's still 18 million on the books. So they still say there's 18 million out there. And that's after the Treasury. Treasury wrote off about $29 million of these things in the mid-1960s. So if you ignore the Treasury write-off, you got to add 18 million and 28 or 9 million together, and you get a much larger number. You get 47 something. So forecast. Here's John Hickman at one time, original estimate, maybe 35 to 50,000 notes survived. And when he passed away, there were 150,000 in the Hickman census. Don Kelly said early in 1997, as his book said, one day we'll have nearly 200,000 known. And then 2006 edition, he said 300 to 400,000 because they keep coming out. So in 2015, this is what was in the National Banknote Census in terms of number of notes. And here you are in early 2017. So watch that number, turn to that number. So the stuff, more is being recorded. This doesn't necessarily mean they came out from the weeds. This is a combination of people actually sharing their serial numbers so they do get reported, plus new notes coming out. This is interesting. In 2015, the existing notes in the census, there's 5 million and change of real face value out there in nationals in all our collections. That number's increased to 5.3 million today. And if you wonder how large versus small, 42% of the census are large-sized notes, 58% of the census is small-sized notes. So what's remarkable is the large number is so big. Yeah, that's really cool to me. But look, so still, the dollar amount now in the census today, you guys, our notes, our combined notes in the census, are still only 29% of what is outstanding on the Treasury records. Still only 29%. That's actually a pretty high number for tracking stuff like this, but you know, that means you got 71% still around somewhere, destroyed forever. And if you ignore the fact that Treasury wrote off almost 29 million back in 62 to 66, if you don't trust the Treasury numbers, then we've actually only recorded 11.3% of the total surviving number from the last redemption figure. So really cool stuff. I know people were asking Jamie questions on the survival of the light green seals. There's more data on this, but it still says there's nationals out there, and that's why you continue to see these things come out of the weeds. So this is the real end, you guys. Go find some great notes. So thank you, everybody. Yeah, you got a question, Bob? And then Carl. Yeah. Go ahead.
When Bill and I wrote our book on nationals,
Yeah, Bob.
I did time series analysis on this nonsense, and I concluded there's 1.25 million notes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So this had 400,000 recorded, and your estimate's 1.25 million.
Right.
Yeah. So like in 3 or 5 years, we need a new number. We need an update, right? Got to see how close we're getting to your number.
I'll tell you the truth, because I did Iowa, which is very well reported.
Yeah.
And I think I came up with 14,000 notes for Iowa by my time series. And they're at 14,000 now.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
Because I mean, not only John Hitman, but Kelly, and Steve Sweeney and his partner been recording everything like crazy. They're at 14,000.
If I took it out of my slide because I was afraid it would run too long, but Peter Huntoon has a really nice chart with 4 different states he tracks, and those lines still go like this. They have not yet bent down to flatten out, like no more notes are coming out. And those were better. They were territorials, Arizona, Wyoming, and I think New Mexico is the other one he tracked. So those are tough states. But let me tell you, the bend is like this. It is still going up. It is not flattened out, meaning these things are still coming out.
The other thing is there's a bunch more smalls around than reported because people see a 252 Pittsburgh and they say, oh, hell, I'm not going to bother reporting that. And I think on that bank alone, and there's 3 other massive banks in Pennsylvania, that there's got to be 5,000, 6,000 each one of them, and they have like 500 reported.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, there's no question. The low value stuff, low grade stuff often never gets reported. Hold on, Bob. Carlton, then Bob.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I talked about Hawaii yesterday, and the bank in Paia, which none are known, is an example of one in which they were printed apparently and sent
Yes,
there.
yeah.
But then the entire supply was returned to the Comptroller of currency. They were never
Yep.
issued to the public. And I know that occurs on some of the $50 and $100 small size. I think the second most common type 2 is in that bracket. Do we have a record? Do we know ones in which the bank essentially returned its entire supply? And also, they paid a tax, didn't they, on this? At what point,
Yeah.
if they were just sitting in their vault, they didn't pay a tax, right? They were not insured.
That was debatable. Some banks report, if you had 50,000 in your vault, by some interpretations of the rules, you still paid the tax on 50,000. It seemed to be a common understanding, though, is if you didn't actually release your notes, you didn't pay tax on them. So people did have banks in the vault and declared them non-circulating, much like a Federal Reserve agent stuff was not called circulating. You can see in the ledgers, some banks get notes and they return the entire delivery in mass, totally unused in one lump sum because they've changed their mind or wanted to cede their bonds to the Fed or something. You see a lot of that stuff. But if it was on the ledgers, the large out is 0 or the total out is 0. If they gave them all back and they did it before 1935, we have those records and you can see it. Post 1935, we know some banks, like the 1,400 charter banks, some of those banks got notes. We never know if they actually released them or not. Well, you can see them on the ledgers if they released them before, summer 1935. But if they gave them all back, you can't. After that, you can't see it. So the only way you know if some of these deliveries ever got out is to see if they had any onesies and twosies redemptions before, I think October 1935. So anyway, Bob first, and then this gentleman. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, Lee, I just wanted to validate Bob's point there, based upon my own research on New York and South Carolina, that those percentages of large versus small are going to dramatically change in the future to where small is going to become a much larger percentage. Because, for instance, I think people have been very diligent on reporting large size notes, but not so on small. An example is, how many people are recording every serial number on a Chase National small size note? I mean, and we know there's thousands of them out there, and people are double-faced notes, they just haven't bothered. So I think, and I've seen this on a couple of common South Carolina banks, where collectors have been very upfront with me saying, oh, I report any decent large note. And I say, well, what about Charleston and Spartanburg? And say, oh, come on, they're common. I can't be bothered. And so you're going to see some, in the future, the population is going to go up, but the percentage of small is going to dramatically increase. Also, if people aren't clear from the numbers, the outstanding numbers you presented, those old Currency Adjustment Act write-offs from the 60s were aimed at the large size notes outstanding.
Yes.
So when you see that 28-point number on notes written off the books, that's virtually all large size notes. So when you see the 18 million out now, figure that's virtually 99% small size.
Yeah.
So
It's also interesting, Bob, you're right, because if there's a large population of unrecorded, low-value, small size that people don't bother with because it's a pain, if those do start getting reported, it's going to make it look like more are coming out of the woodwork. In fact, a lot of that stuff exists in the hobby today. It's just not recorded. So you really, even this data, you got to be careful with. Yeah. This gentleman here, did you have a question? Oh, yeah. Yeah,
there doesn't seem to be much provision to account for counterfeit. Did you discover, or what do we know about the accounting for counterfeit notes during the redemption process?
On the currency and bond ledgers, they didn't record counterfeits because the counterfeits to them were off the books because it wasn't there. It wasn't the bank's. The bank wasn't liable for it. The Treasury wasn't liable for a counterfeit. If a counterfeit came in, the Treasury would actually bill that back to the person who redeemed it for a long time. What was unfair to the banks is legitimate currency came in that was so ratty, or the charter numbers washed off and gone, that they couldn't figure out what bank it was. For many years, they charged the banks back, and the banks ate those legitimate but ratty notes that couldn't be sorted properly. And then the banks complained so, aggressively that that was a ripoff that they eventually changed the law, and the Treasury ate the loss on the unidentifiable notes, as long as they were real. If they were counterfeits, that was tough luck. The guy redeemed it, got it back, and ate it.
Was
So-
that write-off held up until the 1960s when they wrote off the 28 million, or?
The 28 million was unrelated to counterfeits. The 28 million was the Treasury's official educated guess or educated analysis of what they thought was likely destroyed over time, mainly large-sized notes, because of the passage of time, San Francisco earthquake, Chicago fire, the sinking of the Titanic, you name it. All the catastrophic events over the years, money gets destroyed with that. Houses burn down, banks burn down, buildings burn down, and stuff, all money gets destroyed. There was some big amount of money destroyed. Oh, train wrecks destroyed lots of money. Some of them are documented on how much money was destroyed. So all that stuff, when it was destroyed, they didn't know what bank it belonged to. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But all that stuff was approximated by Treasury with those 1962 to 66 write-offs of the $28.9 million. So they just lopped that off the books, mainly because they had to keep a reserve for money they thought didn't exist anymore. So they fought over this in the Treasury all through the 1950s to write this stuff off. And the more conservative guys won all through the 50s. And by the 1960s, the guys saying this is a waste to keep money reserved for this stuff, let's write it off. Those guys ultimately won, and they did the write-off. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, everybody.